Hi, my name is Richard Marsden of the Phoenix Society of Historical Swordsmanship, and I was asked to do a video on the differences between German and Italian longsword. Sorry I can't do a virtual interview. I'm a school teacher, and we just found out this week we have a lot of work to do. So, getting this video out and a couple pictures for you guys before I go to my endless meetings about the new school year. So, with that out of the way, let's define our terms. Is there a German sword, longsword style? And the answer is yes. Is there an Italian? Yes. But let's go a little bit deeper. The first thing is we have to look at, well, what is German? What is Italian? The country of Germany did not exist in the time period that we'll be looking at. Italy didn't either. Instead, we have two different entities that existed from which our longsword material comes out of. On the German side, our main source would be Liechtenauer and his Zettel, followed by a bunch of students and follow-up guys. And in Italy, it was Fiore di Liberi, and we'll talk about his follow-ups a little bit later. But what was the countries that they were from, or the nations, or the states, or whatever you want to call them? So in the case of German, there was a place called the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire wittily said is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And what it was is a loose alliance of German states. And these German states had free cities, little kind of petty kingdoms, powerful electors, and these electors would nominate an emperor to kind of rule over them. And this emperor often found that becoming the Holy Roman Emperor was a poison chalice, because you end up inheriting essentially a disobedient people, if you ask Charles V. So they do speak German. They do have a sense of German culture. The borders are not rigid like we have today, right? They're more loose, but people still recognized German and Germanness, and the sword fighting, the longsword material in particular we'll be looking at, is German. On the Italian side, Italy was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, kind of, at least parts of it were in theory, but the reality is that the emperor rarely crossed the Alps, usually just to get crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, and then he'd take off again. So the Italians were mostly left to their own devices, and they too refer to nationhood and being a country and being Italian, and yet it's terribly divided. It won't be unified until the 1860s. What it was divided into was a series of city-states or small kingdoms, petty kingdoms, that competed with one another during the 13, 14, and 1500s, until eventually power politics would draw in larger nations like France and the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. So that's kind of the region that we're looking at. Both had martial cultures. The Germans, for example, were conducting judicial duels well into the 1400s, where you could sort of challenge a case through right of combat. The Italians, although they kind of got rid of judicial dueling, they still had these very public displays of duels of honor, which you could get killed in, but generally not. All right, when we look at, so now we got the idea of like, okay, who the players are, right? There is a German, there's no Germany, but there are Germans, right? There's no Italy, but there are Italians. And the source material we're looking at is written in the appropriate language. So from Liechtenauer, it's in German, and Fiore stuff's written in the form of Italian. Okay, cool. So time period. We're looking at generally the late 1300s for the start of this material. And for the German stuff, it goes all the way to, there is images of guys with fetters kind of doing like longsword stuff, I think even in the 1700s. Like, it kind of goes a long, long time. Fiore dies out much quicker. So let's talk about our first differences. Well, why? So on Fiore's case, he kind of tells us who he is. He is a fencing master, right? He's the son of an imperial knight. And he says he traveled at great expense to learn from Germans and Italians, and probably a bunch of others, his techniques. And it wasn't just longsword. His works were complete, including like wrestling and dagger and sword in one hand and spear and poleaxe and mounted combat and armored combat and so on. And he said, hey, One of my students said something along the lines of like, you can't memorize all this stuff, so you need to learn from books. And he's like, what a good idea! I want to write a book that kind of puts down my thoughts on how to be a good sword fighter, right, or a good overall martial artist. Who are his students? Elite dudes. He is not teaching to scrubs, that's for sure. He's teaching to guys who were condottieri, mercenary captains of their own, who had troops and commanded and probably already knew a lot about combat. He's teaching kind of to experts, right? Preparing them for duels. These duels of honor that were done in public, that were very expensive, lots of pageantry, in which you probably aren't going to die, fighting in the barriers, he calls it, right? Of himself, he says, hey, I trained many students. He names just, some. He says, I taught in secret. That was kind of important. A lot of his techniques he did not want to get out. And he says, don't teach the peasants. He wanted to keep it a secret. He says, some fought in the barriers, some did not. And then of himself, he says, hey, I fought 5 duels without armor, right? Just wearing my jacket and my gloves, and came away with my honor unscathed. So we know, a little bit about Fiore just from himself, and researchers have done some work on him, and says, okay, yeah, he was this sort of fencing master, possibly mercenary commander of his own, that was catering to the elite. And this may be why Fiore's work doesn't continue on and on and on like we do with the German material. He was writing to a rather specific and tiny audience that actually was getting smaller as history went on, not larger. Of his works, there are 4 that we'll be looking at very briefly. These 4 are 4 manuscripts that are called the Flower of Battle. They're 4 copies. And each one's a little bit different. The Getty is the one that most people use, called MS Ludwig. That one it's the most complete. It has plenty of pictures and plenty of easy to understand text. All right, and it's dedicated to Nicola d'Este, one of the kind of petty princes of the region. All right? Okay, and when he writes this stuff, he does mention it should be done in secret, and he shows tons of techniques, and we'll get more into those a little bit later. So let's hop back to the German side. Well, where does their stuff start from, right? Well, Liechtenauer may not have existed. Like, we don't really know anything about the dude, right? We know that we have this piece of poetry attributed to him, but that's about as far as it goes, right? And this piece of poetry it's a Zettel, and it explains the German style and approach to the fight with, we'll be looking at the longsword. What makes it unusual is that the Zettel is not something that's easy to understand. If you look at Fiore's the Getty, for example, there will be a block of text that you can piece together today fairly easily. It's not rocket science. You look at the Zettel, and I were just to fling up a phrase. If you didn't know what was going on, it would just be kind of gobbledygook, right? So what do we do with this thing? Well, luckily, there was a society of students that came after Liechtenauer, the Society of Liechtenauer, these masters, and we have some of their materials, and they have these things called glosses. There are also those who are not connected to the society that are still sort of using the same terminology and material and approach to sword fighting. So there's like this German style out there, right? And these glosses explain the Zettel. They're like, oh, this is what he wants you to do. Oh, this is what he wants you to do, right? So by piecing together the glosses, we can understand the Zettel better, right? What makes the German system more interesting to me is that it keeps going, right? Fiore doesn't really have a follow-up, right? He's a guy called Vadi, picked up Fiore's work, doesn't cite him by name, but copies some of his works. But when Vadi writes his material, he actually says in his introduction, I'm coming up with something new, right? He mentions the masters of old, which he's probably referring to Fiore, but he says, I'm going to come up with something new, right? So he's not really carrying on the traditions of Fiore, he's just sort of modifying and tweaking it into his own style. And there's no indication that he's like a student Fiore or anything like that. When it comes to the guys on the German side, the early KDF, Kunsteffekten is what they call them, it continues on and on and on and on. And it starts being carried through to masters who are given permission to teach. They form guilds, like the Marksburger Guild. And they're given permission to sort of teach and hold Festschools. Now, Festschule is like a place where you train, like your HEMA club, but it's also where they held sort of like almost like weekly tournaments, right, with a variety of weapons, including a longsword. That doesn't mean like the German longsword material was just for the sporting context. I'm showing a broad window of things. It started off probably for judicial dueling or self-defense or just knightly combat, but over time it became a part of the Festschule, right? Where it was done by these schools all the way into the I think even 1700s, and we have lots of material from it, including Mayer and Meyer from the 1500s. We don't really have that with Fiore. You could look at Marozzo and say, hey, this is Italian, longsword, but there's no connection to Fiore that we see. When we look at stuff from like Meyer or Mayer, the terms they use, the phrases they use, the techniques they use, that goes all the way back to early KDF. So we see like there's this line, right, that we just don't have with the Italians. The Germans lasted longer, which means there's a lot more material to work with and learn and read. What's really neat about the German stuff is if you find something in early KDF that doesn't make sense, well, then you can jump to the 16th century and read about it, and say, well, what were they doing with it, and maybe learn about it that way, right? You can't really do that with Fiore very easily. You have to kind of use what you got, and you can piece and pull things together, but there isn't this tradition that continues on and on and on. And part of it is the audience. Fiore's audience are specific dudes, right? They're specific guys that he's kind of writing to, and it was meant for a small elite society. With the German material, it later transitions to these guilds, right? And these guilds were teaching, we think, an urban middle class who wrote a lot of stuff down, and it was a growing class, right? So the audience kind of grew. And again, lasted well into what we call the early modern era. Okay, so now you get kind of an idea of like who the audiences are and how the manuscripts are different. What about actual presentation? Well, as I said, the Zettel is done in a poem, and then the glosses are sort of explanations for it. You can find more art the later you go, but the original KDF stuff doesn't really have any art, right? Very little. Fiore is different. It's very visual. Actually, he teaches visually. And his book, he tells you in the beginning how he's going to teach. He says, listen, I'm going to show you guys with crowns. These guys are masters that are in like a guard position. And then I'm going to show you other guys with crowns, and they are doing a technique of some sort, like the start of one. Then I'm going to show you guys with a garter on their leg. These are students doing what the master tells them to do, and he shows quite a few of them. And then from time to time, he'll show a guy with a crown and a garter, and this guy is countering a technique. And then occasionally there's counter to counters, but don't worry about that. So what we have is masters, students, and then the occasional countermaster, all visually displayed. And in the case of MS Ludwig, plenty of text from which to work and say, okay, here's what's going on. The German stuff's a little different, right? Terminology obviously is different as well. Fiore has a variety of Italian terms that he uses to describe things. The Germans have their own terms, which would be carried on through centuries, right? With Fiore stuff, not so much. Again, it kind of probably ends with him, or doesn't go much farther that we know of. So there's a difference there, right? The other differences we'd see is preference of techniques, right? So when we look at the German material, for example, there are four sort of primary guards, four ways to hold the longsword. These aren't the only ways. There's actually a lot more, but four kind of primary ones. And they're plow, which is kind of low by the kind of the hip, Alber, the fool, which is brought down before you, Vom Tag, which is kind of on the shoulder, and then we have ox, kind of an extended blade. And we can look at these, like, because art is eventually drawn of it, and we can look at them, and we can look at it from a variety of sources, from different masters and different artists, and get an idea of like, okay, here's kind of what Vom Tag looks like. There's lots of options, right? And here's what ox kind of looks like, and here's what maybe ox looked like in the 1400s, but here's what it looks like in the mid 1500s. So we can kind of compare the two, right? Fiore, we have a lot less to work with. We have his 4 surviving manuscripts, right? We have that, so we can look at that and compare how things are done when it goes to his guards, of which he has a lot more. He doesn't have like 4 primary guards to work from. He has like 12, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. Vadi can be considered, I guess, as a kind of a follow-up to Fiore, and he shows art as well, but it's kind of crude. And that's kind of about it, when it comes to Fiore, of art that we have to work with, right? With a few exceptions. So there's a difference there. When it comes to guards, as I said, the Germans have their 4 primary guards, which if you're into KDF or Meyer, You know those four by heart, right? They're kind of the principal guards. Fiore, a little different. He shows a lot of different guards. Case in point, he has his version of Vomtag is called Woman's Guard, and it looks different. His hands are pulled back, kind of like what we call the Meyer Wrath Guard, away, so that you can't really target his hands. And he shows different varieties of how to do that: leaning forward, leaning back, on the left, on the right, high above the head, right? Showing different options, right? So so when we say Fiore's got a lot of guards, sometimes they're just variations of the same guard, right? He doesn't have an ox like the Germans exactly. Like he has one that's more retracted to keep his hands safe. And there's different people who interpret how it's done. Is it point forward? Is it kind of off to the side? That's up to you. You do your interpretation. But it looks, different than the ox. He has a brevet point, which is kind of low, and it's different than the Flug. German Flug, they have a lot of stuff that you can fight unarmored with, and techniques you can do from the Flug. Fiore, doesn't really say much about his guards. They're very brief, but he does say of his low guard close to the hip, he says, oh, this one's better in armor. Probably because he just wants to stab a guy and not cut him, right? There's a guard that's low called Iron Door. It's a middle Iron Door, and it's similar to Albert the Fool. What they do from these guards, though, are different. Fiore gives you some insights. They're actually pretty brief. And then he has plays later, techniques, and he doesn't really always tell you, like, how to get to these plays. I assume once the crossing of the blade happens, however it happens, how you should perform these plays. The German stuff's a little bit different. It will say, hey, from the Fool, try this when your opponent does something. And if you go to Meyer takes it even further. He says, if he does this, do that. But if he does this, do that. Like, he really takes it on and on and on. Fiore doesn't. All right, he usually just says, if your opponent does this, you do that, and that's it. All right, with a few exceptions. He doesn't talk a lot about combos. I think maybe one. So there's a little bit of difference there of how they hold their swords and how the instructions are given on how to use them. What about other differences? When we look at other differences, let's look at the thrust. So one of the things that you hear is like, hey, Germans were not keen on thrusting. Well, the kind of the argument comes from something that Meyer mentions about, like, hey, we Germans really don't thrust one another, but you need to know how to do it because certain outsiders do, and he's probably referring to the Italians. There is some truth to that, in that when you stab a person in the past, because medical care is what it is, people tended to die, and when you cut a person, they could possibly live. We see this in Polish literature where they talk about, like, you don't stab fellow Poles. You stab people in warfare, but you just cut each other up and you'll survive. The Germans seem to be doing something very similar. We're like, hey man, you don't stab a guy. That's crazy. You can cut him, sure, but don't stab him. The Italians, they said, oh, forget that. We're stabbing each other, right? They developed a whole weapon system based on the thrust, which they got, criticized for. They're like, wow, these Italians are really murderous. We're just settling disagreements with one another. We're being, we're at risk. We're probably not going to die. These Italians, once they start stabbing each other, they're going to die, and that's influencing the rest of us. So when they say, hey, Germans don't stab, well, they're aware of the thrust, right? Meyer teaches how to use a rapier, for example, and shows you how to stab with it. Clearly, they knew how to stab with a longsword, but culturally, you weren't really supposed to. But if you go back to early KDF, it seems to be a bit more mortal in that they don't care if you do stab, right? They give you techniques on how to do it. Okay, so that kind of covers the similarities and differences with the thrusts. How about techniques themselves, like specific techniques? Well, there'll be differences, but sometimes they do the same thing. Case in point, in the German system, there's something called an Absetzen, where you sort of set aside somebody's thrust in exchange for your own, so that they're trying to stab you, and you either cut or push or move it aside, do some footwork, and you stab the opponent, and they don't stab you. Fiore does the same thing, right? He does the same thing. He calls it an exchange of the thrust, where an opponent's trying to stab you, you move it off the side, you do some footwork, and you stab the opponent, and he doesn't stab you. The imagery that they show is different, but the concept is the same, right? The Germans have these things called Meisterhaus, or hidden strikes, or master strikes, and they're ways to sort of break guards. They're like, hey, if someone is in this guard, you can do this technique, and it'll defeat it. Fiore doesn't really quite have that. That would be a difference between the two when it comes to techniques. Fiore generally says, here's my guards. He briefly describes how to cut, right? He does talk about you can break guards, but doesn't really show it. And then he shows a lot of like, hey, our swords are crossed at the tips, the middle, and the close. Here's what we do. Right, Germans are a little bit different. They have some pretty specific techniques. If a guy's in this position, do that. Other differences is the actual approach to the fight itself. So Fiore doesn't explicitly say, hey, when you're approaching a fight, you should be seeking to like gain control over it, right? He doesn't say anything like that. It's all implied, and as a historian, you guys have to sort of interpret it on your own. What Fiore does show is he seems to show a lot of techniques in which he likes to counterfight, where he is leaned back, he's kind of retracted, or he's waiting, and he doesn't mind being attacked, because my interpretation is he understands if I know where I'm being attacked from, I kind of am in control of the fight. If I lean far back and I force my opponent to cut deep, then I know what he's doing and I can do things to counter that, right? If my sword is off to the side in what we call a boar's tooth, and I'm inviting my head to be attacked, something he was used to do in tournaments all the time, and my opponent throws an attack at me, I can deflect, do the right footwork, hopefully, and strike my opponent, right? And I'm waiting for them. It's a very classic Fiore thing. The Germans are a little different. They talk about like, hey, if he's in this guard, do these sort of master strikes. You have this thing called the Vor, which is like the initiative in the fight. You want to seize that and control it. And in the moment, the indies, you want to kind of act. If you're behind the game, right, you're trying to counterfighting, you're fighting in the knock, you're fighting in the after. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, you can, but you want to like regain the Vor, right? Don't take this as if you're German, you just have to run into a fight as quick as you can and attack first. That's not really what they're saying. But there is like a strategy of like, hey, if you are the one attacking, then things are going pretty well for you. All right, you might, especially if you're attacking the right time and the right distance. Where Fiore doesn't mind being attacked at all. Right, there's no caution of like, hey, don't let them go first. Right, he seems to not mind. Fiore breaks up the fight in that here's guards, and then here's what happens at the wide measure where he just shows a couple of things. Sort of the middle measure where he shows a bit more. Labeled all as wide measure, but he shows tips and middle crossings, and then he shows a lot of stuff from the close. Right, the Germans are a little bit different in that. Right, so a little difference there. When it comes to plays when you're actually closing with one another, there's differences, techniques that you see in the German tradition that you could interpret from Fiore but don't necessarily see. So a good example is Durchlaufen. The two German opponents will come together, their blades kind of bind high, right? They're pushed up, and one guy's like, aha, and he takes the sword in one hand, and with his free hand he kind of does a hip throw to the opponent, right? And Fiore's, when he shows his close plays, he doesn't really show that. You could maybe look at his wrestling and say, well, he shows it in the wrestling, couldn't I kind of attribute it to the longsword section? He wants you to, so yes, but you have to like make that connection. Okay, so there'll be different close plays techniques, right? Fiore likes to smash teeth out with his pommel. And then Germans show some pommeling as well, but Fiore really seems to like it. Fiore likes to grab the sword. There's quite a few where he'll like, ha, caught your sword, right? Because if it's not moving, it's not dangerous, right? And I don't see a ton of that with the German stuff. You'll see them grab their own swords and half sword, but not a lot of grabbing the opponent's blade. Other differences would be certain things that the Germans focus on that the Italians don't clearly. Winding. So two German fighters, their blades cross, and one move in one direction from the other, each trying to find like an angle to cut or stab from. They're doing these like 8 windings, right? 8 different ways you can kind of move the sword from across and win. Fiore doesn't explicitly say here's how to wind. You can interpret it, and some people do. But what he generally shows is like, oh, you're at a cross, do some of these things. Another little difference would be that Fiore's work, the Flower of Battle, is supposed to be taken as a complete whole. You can just read the longsword section and become a fairly good fighter, but you are missing out because when we look at the Flower of Battle, it covers, wrestling, dagger, and a bunch of stuff, but it all informs each other, right? You have to kind of read the whole book to really get the best out of longsword out of it. Like, well, how so? I'll give you an example. In a sword in one hand section, he says, hey, when you come to the close, the cross, you can sort of grab this guy's hand and twist it, very similar to a dagger play that you see. And then he actually calls one out. He says you can also put them in a middle bind, which I showed you in like the third dagger master, or third dagger play earlier in the book, right? So he makes some direct references. And you can find some longsword material hidden in places you may not expect. It's in the mounted section at some point, which is kind of the end of the Getty, where he says something along the lines of like, hey, when blades are crossed at the tip, the action happens quickly, and in the middle, slower, and at the guard, slowest. Right? That would have been great in the longsword section, but it's tossed over into mounted. His spear section is incredibly short. Like, if you want to become like a Fiore spear master, there's like only like six plays, I think, maybe, and some of them are just replicated one another. There's not much to it, because the way I interpret it is, if you understand the exchange of the thrust, then you already know kind of how to use a spear, right? It's just playing off of that technique plus some more, right? When it comes to the poleaxe, he doesn't even show a lot of attacks with the poleaxe. He shows that you're already crossed up and kind of what to do. Probably because he says, hey, if you know how to use woman's guard and break a thrust or attack, you already know how to do it, right? So there's a little bit of difference, is how he approaches it. Fiore shows some weird stuff too that the Germans don't. And what I mean by weird stuff is Fiore has an example of poison powder to blind the opponent, right? That's a bit unusual. He shows some odd stuff like how to fight with tree branches, which you get in Mayer, but you're not going to get in a lot of the other German sources, right? How to fight with like a walking staff or dagger versus sword and things like that. So little differences there. What they both approach differently, and is kind of or similar, is the Germans have a separate kind of section for armor fighting. They understood that armor fighting and out of armor, in and out of armor is a little different. Fiore does as well. He says a lot of his plays work in and out of armor. He says they're fine, but he does have an entire section just for armored combat in his source material. Right? Okay, so got about 4 minutes left in this half-hour video, so let's kind of bring it all around. We have German and Italian source material, right? We have a German tradition that lasts a lot longer, therefore there's more ink spilled and more to read and look and watch and learn from. The Italian, we have a lot less. We have them both using similar weapon systems roughly around the same time. We have similar techniques from some, but not identical, right? We have probably a different approach to the fight from the Liechtenauer tradition, the KDF tradition, than we do from Fiore's, right? Fiore, I would say, is a counter fighter at heart, right? At least he seems to spend a lot of time on that. Well, on the KDF side, I think they really want to shut someone down as quick as they can, right? It's my interpretation of it. Not the only interpretation, but mine. So there's that. The other thing, too, is you'll hear a phrase from people that, like, in martial arts often, it's like there's only so many ways the human body moves. And so all martial arts are very similar. Yeah, that's true, right? There is only so many ways the human body moves. But your preferences do matter, right? Otherwise, there'd be just one martial art, right? There would be longsword, the final, right? And it isn't that way. Masters have their preferences, right? The KDF tradition has its preferences. The later KDF stuff, the Meyer stuff, has its preferences, right? For various reasons. And Fiore, and we only have him to work with, has his own preferences, right? Vadi, who followed up, actually says, hey, I'm kind of discarding some of this stuff and coming with my new ideas. So think of it as that, like, they will share a lot of common ground, but they won't be identical, right? And you can really learn a lot from reading both. Okay, so that gives you kind of a quick summary of German versus Italian, and hopefully you can do some research on your own and kind of see for yourself how they are similar and different, right? Just quick visual perusal will start making connections for you. And what's really neat is when you start looking at both source material, you'll learn some cool stuff. So example, Fiore shows a boar's tooth. It's a blade off to the side where you deflect an opponent's attack and then strike him back. And I always thought it was a distinctly Italian thing. But later I was reading some German material, I can't even remember what it was, and that same technique is in there. It's described a little differently, but it's doing the same thing, like the sweeping technique followed by a play back. So I'm like, oh, it's the same, right? Just taught differently. So I hope that you go on a similar journey. So my name is Richard Marsden from the Phoenix Society of Historical Swordsmanship. It's been a lovely half hour, and I look forward to reading your comments and seeing what you guys think about the difference between the German and Italian systems, if we're okay using those terms.